And so to the intrepid Dr. Simon Martin, thanks to Simon for stepping into this virtual forum. Simon, as many of you will know, is Associate Curator and Keeper in the American section at the Penn Museum. He received his Ph.D. from the Institute of Archaeology, University College London, and holds an MA from the Royal College of Art in London. He is a specialist on Maya hieroglyphic writing, with research that focuses on history, politics, and religion. Since 1994, he has done field work at the site of Calakmul in Mexico, and is known for the co-authored books Chronicle of the Mayan Kings and Queens from 2000 and Courtly Art of the Ancient Maya from 2004. His new book is now out in the UK. He says he hasn't actually seen it himself yet, and it's on its way to here to the US. It's entitled Ancient Maya Politics, a Political Anthropology of the Classic Period 150 to 900 CE, and includes a wealth of new historical information based directly on Simon's groundbreaking decipherment of Maya monuments. Certainly something to look forward to. He has also curated exhibitions at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. and at the Penn Museum, including Maya 2012, where he played a key role. Simon was also the lead curator on our spectacular new Mexican and Central American gallery, which opened to the public this past November. On top of all this, Simon is the 2019-2020 holder of the prestigious J.I. Kislak Chair for the Study of the History and Cultures of the Early Americas in the John W. Klug Center at the Library of Congress. So please join me now in both congratulating and welcoming Dr. Simon Martin, who will talk to us about the classic Maya collapse, new evidence on a great mystery. Simon.
Thank you, Steve. I hope everyone can see me and hear me well. I am going to share my screen. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to downtown Philadelphia. I know we have some international viewers. We have people watching in Central Europe and all the way over to the West Coast of the US. So there's some people staying up very late and some people still early in the afternoon. I'm going to talk today about one of the most remarkable, massive, strange social disintegrations that the world has ever seen. I'm going to talk for about an hour or so and take you all through the essential background to that, the dominant theories, and some of the new data which is beginning to transform our understanding of that event. Okay. So somewhere around the year 800 and all the way until the early 10th century, so sometime just after 900, classic Maya civilization came to an end. And what we're seeing here is Tikal, the site which Penn Museum excavated from 1956 to 1969, represented a couple of decades or so after the collapse. So the city is no longer maintained, it's not being whitewashed or weeded or swept, and the jungle is beginning to come back. Of course, it would soon sweep over every Maya settlement. So the part of the world I think most people here will know, we're talking about the toe of Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. And this is a view of just a selection of the enormous numbers of massive Maya sites. And they peaked, they reached their largest population and greatest refinement in this era, the 600 to 800. And this is when we see the most naturalistic and finely wrought Maya art. Architecture, this very precise rectilinear style, temples and plazas and ball courts and palaces. Fine working in very hard materials like jade and other kinds of greenstones. Incredibly delicate work here with flint. This is chert, so this has been expertly knapped to produce these very elaborate shapes. and many painted plates and cylinder vases. And the remarkable thing about them is the way in which they give us insights into Maya mythology. So there's a wealth of material here which takes us into the mindscape of the ancient Maya. Incredibly valuable from that point of view. And of course, we have this enormously elaborate calendar system, something which began to be worked out in the 19th century and will form a kind of a framework and skeleton for the chronology we're going to be talking about, and the writing system. This is something which began to be deciphered really only in the 1980s. This is when the phonetic decipherment of Maya writing began, and it is an ongoing process. We're still deciphering new signs. We still have some way to go, but the majority of text can now be read with a fair degree of certainty. So in that period, 600 to 800, we have the maximum extent of Maya civilization, the highest populations, the greatest social sophistication. This is a view of Tikal. But of course, that doesn't exist anymore, and it came to an end fairly rapidly. This is what you see if you want to look at Maya architecture in the flesh. This is what happens if you walk into the forests of Central Mexico or Central America. You're going to see mounds like this, completely indistinct fallen buildings. Even when we've cut back the brush and we're seeing here these larger temple structures, they're so completely covered, they're so part of the landscape that it's easy, very easy, to mistake them for natural. And they were rediscovered only in the 19th century. And this is when some intrepid explorers, people from Europe and the United States, started going down to that area, started traveling, discovering new sites, doing wonderful illustrations, and later on, photography, as the brush, as the trees, as the vines were cut back, and this civilization was brought to light once again. Now, one of the things that they found, a whole category of things, are the Maya monuments. And here we see one at Calakmul, strangled, broken. This is what most Maya monuments on the surface looked like. And this is one of the reasons that we need to do archaeology, to find well-preserved things that are beneath the surface. But nonetheless, there's lots and lots of information, even on stones that look like this. And from that, we've been able to piece together at least part of the story I'm going to be telling this evening. Now, this classic period begins, as Steve mentioned, about 150. But the earliest monument that we have comes from Tikal. It was discovered by Penn, and it's dated to 292. This is in the Maya long count system. And very briefly, the way that works is that we have units up here, which are of 400 years, units here, which are about 20 years, here single years, and then 20-day months and individual days. So in the Maya numerical system, bars are 5 and dots are 1. So we have 8, you can see, and then 12, and then 14, and 8, and 15. And that's the way we notate it that today, 8, 12, 14, 8, 15. And through some quite elaborate calculations and a lot of hard work by many scholars, we can align that with a high degree of certainty to the year 292. Now, the other end of Maya carved history in the lowlands comes at Tonina, which is actually on the beginning of the highlands, and that is about 600 years later. So that gives us here the units of 10. You can see the 2 bars, which make 10, and then 4, and then these signs are zeros. So we have one missing off the bottom. What it's notating is 104000, and that equates to 909. And this is the last dated long count monument. There are a few later, sometimes arguable dates, but this is the last long count date in this form. Now, after that, Maya writing continues. It continues into a period we call the post-classic, and didn't die out until the time that the Spanish arrived. But already in this era, you can see a massive change, and some sites are erecting monuments like this one. This is a site called Yashom in the northern lowlands, and this has a long count. It sort of begins with sort of long. But everything here is gobbledygook. This is nonsensical. So this is a monument put up to look like writing, but it isn't. And I think it's really profound in telling us the ways in which writing was still highly valued. But at this place, at least, there was simply no one who was literate anymore. So this is a full display I did recently, which shows the number of dated monuments for each of these eras. So we start here in this period is the early classic from 300 to 600, then the late classic from 600 to 800, and then this last century here, some people call the terminal classic, which I tend to avoid. I just refer to it as the 9th century. So we can see arc, of course, where we reach a peak around the middle of the 8th century. We're undoubtedly missing monuments around here because we find broken early classic monuments deposited inside structures. So many of those have still to be found. I'm sure that they won't reach this kind of peak, but they at least would probably fill out some of this area here. So let's look at the sort of heart of the central southern lowlands. And this is a selection of the dates, which are terminal. So these are the last carved monument dates in the long count system. And they vary from about 790 to I showed earlier on. So this is covering just over 100 years. And in that went from peak population, the greatest artistic achievements, to desolation. Now, of course, archaeology has a big part to play in this. Chronology we have from the epigraphy, and that gives us remarkable to-the-day accuracy. But we rely very much, especially on sites that don't have inscriptions, to discover their fate through archaeology. And through accounts of ceramics and architecture, there are a very, still fairly loose, but nonetheless very interesting population graph like this. And you can see how closely it matches that monument count from the previous chart. So we have a sort of growth period here in the early classic, and a peak again around this same period here in the mid 8th century before a very rapid decline. So let's look at some of these theories. Now, we'll realize that Maya civilization came to an end, which they discovered very early on. There's been many ideas, and some are much better than others. I'm going to mention as many as I can, but it is scratching really only the surface. I've certainly left out lunatic ones. So various people have argued that there's sort of psychological factors, sort of psychocultural factors. And one of them is simply that there's tremendous growth and energetic civilization sort of ran out of steam. It's kind of cultural exhaustion. And with that sometimes is this idea of determinism. So there may have been something, for example, in the Maya calendar that said that all the cities should be abandoned. Maybe there was some oracle which told the Maya, or foretold the end of the Maya, and they sort of conveniently and happily went along with this. I think that there's no reason to believe any of these. Now, loosely gathered under what we could call biological is things like population growth. So this again is where the whole society is put under stress by simply being too many people with too little food. And as we'll discuss it a little bit more later on, but there's good reason to think that, well, we know the jungle is a very difficult place to grow food. Now, the other sort of vaguely biological idea is pathology, so disease. And this is a reproduction of a version of a scene from an Aztec. So this is very late and not from the Maya area. And it's showing, as far as I know, I think smallpox. And of course, this was diseases brought by the Europeans, by the Spanish when they came to the New World. And there's lots of experts who have severe doubts whether pathology, epidemics, have so much power in the Americas, because so many of the diseases we suffer from come through animals, come through our livestock. And in the Maya area and throughout Mesoamerica, there simply wasn't that kind of interaction with captive, domesticated animals. However, I guarantee, for reasons you might be able to guess, that pathology will in some way come back to the fore. I imagine it's a new wave of enthusiasm for looking at ancient American diseases. Now, we sort of get into the ones which are more popular and have the most scholarly attention. And these are sort of vaguely social, but they're all things to do with conflict. Beginning in particular in the 20th century, the idea that there was a mass revolt, that the people rose up against their tyrannical rulers, took over the sites, killed the elite, and this led to a general collapse in society. A very sort of different take on the idea of revolt is the second one on the list, which is the idea of a nobles' revolt. So this is where the sort of upper classes are rebelling against the divine or semi-divine kings, and their rebellion is something that destabilized Maya society and led to the collapse. Then we have the idea of invasion, which had its heyday back in particularly the 1960s. We'll hear more detail about all of these. And then finally, internecine warfare, so internal Maya against Maya conflict. And I should stress that, in the old days, we used to think a lot about the idea of single causes, and that is a very unfashionable idea today. Today, we think much more about multiple causes. So it could indeed be a combination of any of the factors that I'm mentioning tonight, and some others that we don't know, and that simply there isn't one prime mover, there isn't one single magic bullet which took them down, but it's something much more intricate and something much more interlocking. So let's first look at Piedras Negras. This is the site in Guatemala where Penn worked, excavated in the 1930s. And one of the things that Penn found was this royal bench. This is a throne for the rulers of Piedras Negras. And we can see on the front there's inscriptions. And then it's carved back with these two faces, and it's actually there are two eyes here. This is a sort of big monster face with figures coming out of the eyes. Now these faces are completely reconstructed because the whole bench was found smashed into pieces. And this is the niche where that throne used to sit, and the legs came out here. And then these are all blocks smashed into pieces. So somebody, whether it's a noble, whether it's a commoner, or whether it's an invader, took Piedras Negras apart in at least when it comes to the royal sanctuaries like this one. Now, another thing which ties into the idea of this sort of kind of uprising against the elite is the defacement of monuments. Here we have one from Cancun in Guatemala, and you can see that the faces have been bashed in. Now, you can certainly find monuments like this, but in all honesty, there really isn't very many. And there are many sites where perfectly untouched monuments were never in any way attacked or defaced. And I think the idea that this is evidence for a particular uprising is extremely weak, and we shouldn't really pay any attention to that. Now, this idea of the nobles' revolt, it partly comes from the ways in which architecture and wealth were changing 100 years or so of classic civilization. At this time, the nobles are building bigger buildings and more luxurious ones. So the main image here is from the region of Rio Bec. And this is a part of the Maya world where multiple elite residences suddenly spring up. So we lose the focus on a central royal court and some, smaller subsidiary. It becomes very hard to distinguish a royal court from a noble court, that they all seem to be pretty much on the same level. And for this to happen, there must be a financial and economic more wealth staying in the hands of nobles rather than going into. Down here, the inset image is from Copan. And inside these buildings, this is a part of the site called Sepulturas, we have very elaborately carved thrones. And so it's not just the magnificence of the building, they're also commissioning their own art. And this, which comes from the region of Yaxchilan, is an unidentified site, shows the new prominence of these nobles. So on the right-hand side, we have not a king, but a subsidiary lord. The king is over here, but the noble is taking the prestige position. This right-hand right-hand side is where the most important person stands. And for them to appear in this kind of position along with kings is some innovation in this period. Again, possibly a sign that nobles and kings are recalibrating the power between them. So let's move on and talk about Sebal, up the Usamasynta into a new river system called the Passion, and to the idea of invasion. Now, this also has a Penn connection because our former director, the much respected and loved Jerry Sabloff, worked as a graduate student at Sebal in the 1960s. And he and as well as Dick Adams, working at a nearby site, found lots of things which to them suggested foreign influence. This is Stela 1 from Sebal. It's an unusual style. We have elements here that we have not seen before, some of which you could say have appeared earlier in the Maya area, but they become much more prominent and much stranger. The inscriptions are pretty standard, but a lot of these motifs and these ways of putting iconography together are different. Some are in a style which is much more typical of the Gulf Coast area. So this is beyond the Maya realm to the west, central Mexico, but particularly where central Mexico comes down to the Gulf of Mexico. So these kinds of images and this kind of flowing hair is much area. New forms of ceramics come in. So the great tradition during the classic period had been painted polychrome ceramics. Those pretty much disappear, and about 800. And after that, we have these mold-made vessels. Now, this one here was found at Ceibal, but we have one in our collection. So in the newly installed gallery, we have one which was made from the same mold as this. And doubtless many were made. So these were mass produced. This was the whole point about molding as opposed to hand painting, which was obviously each one was one. The firing of a polychrome ceramic is very, very elaborate and highly, you need tremendous experience. Vessels like this, once you actually have the mold, are very, very easy to produce. Really show a drop in expertise. Now, this vessel very last painted polychromes, and the style is already losing a lot of the elaborate work that we had in the classic period. It's earlier in the classic period. Oh, excuse me. But what I'm pointing out here is the fact that here we have pretty normal hieroglyphs, but here we don't. These are day signs, but not Maya day signs. They're day signs in a central Mexican system. And here they're not serving as a date. They're actually serving as a name. They are part of this name here. So we have a name which is part composed of Maya glyphs and part using a calendrical system from outside the Maya area. And this was also seen as being a pivotal piece of the puzzle. Another thing was architecture. So we have new architectural forms. We have C-shaped buildings. That's a ground plan in the state, sort of an extended U shape or C shape, and particularly these circular buildings. There's never that many of them, but they're a real departure from things that we see in the classic period. So the idea is that the great Usumacinta River, leading on to the Pasión and to the whole central Petén, was a highway where people could have approached from the west new societies or new to the Maya area societies, perhaps militaristic societies that overwhelmed the Maya. And this was the idea not just of the archaeologists I mentioned, but also Sir Eric Thompson. Thompson was the sort of the doyen. He was the sort of the great thinker of the whole middle 20th century. He was a particular proponent of the idea that all the strange features in the Maya area that come in the 9th century are the result of invasion. So let's mention now the idea of internecine warfare and mention these two other sites, Dos Pilas and Aguateca. Now, warfare had always been a part of Maya society, and that really is no innovation. Is that this gained in intensity, it gained in destructiveness, and some of the rules by which warfare was conducted were abandoned, and warfare became more destructive. And we certainly see lots of signs for increased warfare. Now, these are two images, both of the center of Dos Pilas. You can recognize that it's actually the same view. At the top, we have what it in the 700s, and down below what it would have looked like in the 800s. So what's happened is that a sort of village has formed in the middle of the plaza, and they have stripped the stone from the great temples to make these concentric walls around the site. So it's really just a little village which has defended itself with this double wall system. Now, nearby at Aguateca, we have some really explicit evidence. So they were building large wall systems. And in fact, we know that they were under construction because quite a few of them were still incomplete and presumably were in the act of building against a particular enemy. And that enemy overwhelmed Aguateca around 800. So this is a National Geographic view of the storming of Aguateca. And that site is like, it's sort of the Maya version of Pompeii. When the archaeologists, Takeshi Inamata, were working there, started excavating the buildings, they found the contents still intact. So smashed and burned because the buildings had been brought down, but things still in their original locations. They also found bodies, people simply lying around. And it looks as if after this ferocious attack, the site was completely abandoned. Nobody came back, nobody buried the bodies, no one even retrieved some of the valuable objects. It was completely finished as a site. So the idea of internecine warfare, internal warfare, is one of the two main paradigms active today for the collapse of Maya civilization. Now, there are others, and we have ecological ones. So we have this relationship between the Maya and their environment. One of them, of which there is some evidence in some places, is soil exhaustion and then deforestation. These are sort of predicated on the ideas of Maya subsistence being what's called swidden agriculture. Now, this is what Maya farmers today do. They will burn down new forest areas. They will plant maize, but the nutrients do not last very long. So after a number of years, those fields have to be abandoned. You have to move on somewhere else while that soil recovers. Now, for reasons we'll also come to, there's really no chance that that was the system that ancient Maya civilization used. Deforestation comes into the same general category, and I'll really talk about these things in a minute. But at the time that Jared Diamond was creating his well-known book about the collapse of societies, those were very important thoughts. It was the idea that the Maya had destroyed their own environment. And this is something that Diamond picked up, referring to some quite legitimate academic sources. But it was very much an idea of its time. And today, very few people think the Maya exhausted their environment. In fact, there's lots of evidence that they were excellent designers of their own ecological system. The ways in which they were building terraces and check dams and canals and reservoirs were really quite intricate, and we only have evidence of that in recent times. So the Maya were not destructive of their environment. They were, if anything, they were fantastic users and very, very efficient users of what ostensibly is a very poor environment. So here, of course, we have modern scenes of the forest being burnt back. And today, tragically, this is really mostly for cattle farming. So this is where the jungle is destroyed. And this is really a considerable problem with the destruction of Central American nature. Now, one of the other parts of this were lake core sediments. So this is drilling down in the heart of lakes to show all the runoff that's come from the land and how it's been deposited in lakes. And this shows that there was a considerable runoff in these kind of periods. Again, this was seen to be a destruction of the soil and evidence that farming was becoming more difficult. I think today we tend to think that this is just simply a sign of success. This was the inevitable result of the mass intensive farming that was going on. And in any case, this is fairly patchy. There's lots of areas where this kind of big runoff has never been detected. So sort of the real large-scale natural kind of ideas. I find it very hard to believe, but some people really did think that Maya civilization came to an end by earthquake. There were a couple of places where it looks as if you can see the remains, fractures caused by genuine earthquakes. Why this would lead to the collapse of a civilization, I don't know, but that was suggested. And then we have hurricanes as another, and then general climatological explanation. So I'll skip over earthquakes and look at hurricanes, because hurricanes are potentially extremely damaging. Now, we're used, of course, to these big systems barreling up through the Gulf of Mexico. And they don't often come into the Maya area, or at least not today. But there's lots of signs that the Maya were worried about this, because if you look at the map today, you'll find very, very few major settlements on the Belizean coast. It looks as if they had a real interest in staying away from that coast. And it could well be because of batterings by hurricanes. Now, the real problem with hurricanes, though, is not so much people, it's agriculture. A hurricane came through the Maya area in the 20th century and was recorded to have destroyed 98% of all the maize that was growing in the Penn, which is the central area, at that time. Now, of course, there's not very many people living there at that time. But if you imagine that on an intensive farming system, and one which is very finely balanced with an essential need for the food coming in for, as we will discover, very large populations, then a bad storm at just the wrong time could have been very disastrous. Now, the idea that this would have killed off everyone, I think, is very unrealistic. So what we're talking about here is more the disruption of society, the idea that the kings have let society down, that the gods are no longer protecting people. And so really it's what foments maybe some of these other things like internal warfare, class warfare, all of these things. Again, maybe multi-causal, not single causal. Now the big one here is drought. And drought has become the most favored paradigm for the destabilizing of classic Maya civilization. Now, strangely, the reason we know that, or one of the reasons we know that, and the way we find out about it, is going underground. The Maya area is riddled with caves. This is a limestone shelf where the water tunnels down and forms rivers, caverns, deep cave systems. Now, into those, of course, filter water, and these create stalactites and stalagmites. Now, when we cut those, or when experts cut them, they are essentially just like dendrochronology. These are like looking at tree rings, but what's happening is they're water deposits. They've been coming down. Obviously, this is on its side, but the water would be trickling down, or down here or down there, depending on whether it's a stalactite or stalagmite, and depositing calcium. So through this, you can count back in time and look for maybe certain kinds of markers, certain kinds of maybe volcanic eruptions, leaving certain extra elements in the atmosphere, ways in which you can calibrate these rings with precise years. Now, this is not by any means a simple process. One has to take into account many factors, including the whole nature of the rock which the water is filtering through. But in theory, and if it's done correctly, it will tell you how much water was falling, how much rainfall there was in any given year. In fact, not even every year, indeed every season. And in theory, we could get down to every month. So there's tremendous potential in analyzing these speleothems, as a technical term. And I think once we have each one of these really costs a tremendous amount of money, time and labor and laboratory analysis. So we only have in the region of 4 or 5 of these sets of data. Once we have 50, once we have covered all the Maya area, then I think we'll have an incredibly accurate and important record about rainfall. What this shows is a lot of variation. So we have high rainfall and we have droughts. And you can see that it's really bouncing all over the place all the time. There is a very, very severe drought here, but you can see that it's actually quite a bit later than the Maya collapse. So the date that we're talking about is around here. This is much later. So if one of these peaks, somewhere around there, was the destabilizing factor, it has to be predicated on other things. For example, that the level of population has become so high that Maya society become uniquely vulnerable. So this is has to be factored in as something which would make a drought that destructive. Not all of these studies agree. So we're having to average out lake core settlements, speleothems from different regions. And eventually, as I say, I think we'll come to something very accurate. At the moment, there's variability. So precisely finding one particular drought that could have been the killer, I think is still not quite there. But nonetheless, if you were to ask most Maya scholars today, they would say that drought is very likely to be some kind of factor. The evidence suggests that these are multi-year droughts. And if you have a big shortfall in rain going on for 4, 5, 6 years, then this could seriously destabilize society. Now, what I'm going to do now is move on. So the speleothem data is part of this new evidence. This is part of the new insights we're getting through archaeology and technology. Now, another one which is happening at the same time and is equally remarkable is a system called Lidar. So this is airborne laser scanning. And those of you who came to the lecture I gave a couple of years ago called the Urbanized Jungle was one that I particularly talked about Lidar. What we're looking at here is a Google Earth view of Tikal. So in the center is the central plazas, Temple 1, Temple 2, the North Acropolis. Out here, the big Temple 4, and here the Plaza of the Seven Temples, etc., etc. But still lots of forest cover. What LiDAR does by using a laser in an aircraft which penetrates the canopy, gets down to ground level, reflects back, and uses lots of fancy software processing, what you can do is that. So that is precisely the same view, except with LiDAR rather than with normal photography. So you can imagine what kinds of insights are possible once we can look at the terrain in that kind of detail. And there are many things we can do. There are many different kinds of filters. There's different ways of looking at soil. There's ways of combining this with other kinds of GIS and measuring different forms of slope and analyzing different soils. And in particular, looking for permanent features created by the Maya. So terracing, reservoirs, and particularly structures, including defensive structures. And some of the really new and exciting work is on field systems. So this is where the whole old idea about Swidden agriculture, it's called slash and burn, has to come to an end, because we can see vast field systems. In the Maya area, the biggest sites are located next to what's called bajos. So these are the low-lying areas which are seasonally inundated. They are today, and they form a swampy area which is almost impassable in the rainy season. However, now using LiDAR, we can see that these were not empty landscapes, that these were agriculture on a vast scale. So these were covered in canals, raised fields, irrigation, specially manipulated with large reservoirs in certain places too. So the idea of very high population levels becomes immediately much more persuasive. The limiting factor that the jungle is a terrible place to try and grow a lot of crops is ended. We don't have that problem anymore. We know that there was fertile land which was constantly being used. And we're not just talking about small areas here. These bajos are covering thousands of square kilometers. So this is a big, big area. Now, I mentioned also about architecture. And so this is a site called Naachtoon in Guatemala. And it's on the edge of a bajo, so you can see down here, this low-lying land, and you can see some of these traces of field systems and the architecture up here. Now, the scale of the Lidar scans means that we can look at not just individual sites like this, but whole areas, whole terrains. Now, up here, that's the bajo we just looked at. Before we were looking south, now we're looking plan view with north up here, and that was that area. Everything else here is a home, is a house, or a group of homes. So you can see two things. One is the Maya style of low density settlement. So there's a lot of agriculture going on in between all of these houses, as well as in the bajos. These sort of kitchen gardens where people were growing herbs and medicinal plants and specialist things, chili and things like that. All of this area would also have been green with trees, with little maize plots, as well as the sort of the high levels of intensive agriculture out in the bajos. Imagine this not in a little 2-kilometer stretch here, but spreading over the whole area. So you can get some idea of how many people were living there. And this is a collection. That was the Natchatun section up there. But these are the other sections which have been done so far. Down here at Tikal, all the way out to La Corona, Olmor, Chiltun, etc. Right now, there is a project which will cover, if not the whole area, then almost the whole of northern Guatemala. And that will be the most revelatory tool that Maya archaeologists have ever had. It will be something really remarkable. So far, you can see these density maps. You can see populations. You can see how dense that Natchatun area is, but also around Tikal, but also how it starts wheedling out quite dramatically out towards the west. These are areas which are ostensibly very similar to this kind of terrain, maybe not so many bajos. But if the idea is the Maya were just short of land, there was too many people, there's not enough agriculture, they could easily have moved into these areas and eked out some kind of living. So it looks as if they really stayed in these areas because they were just hunky-dory. There was really no problem at all. So, of course, what we're looking at here with this kind of chart was a relative chart. So it doesn't try and tell you how many people there are. It just tells you the scale, the relative scale between not very many and a lot. By counting the homes, which Lidar is showing us, we can create some really quite accurate population estimates. And the people who are working on this suggest that the central area, so not even the entire Maya area, but the central high density area, could easily have contained about 10 million people. So again, this would have been hard to imagine without this agricultural system, which may have made that possible. So the two really fit together. From our point of view, talking about the collapse, it's very significant because it means that not just some people disappeared, moved somewhere else, or whatever. It means that a huge number of people moved and went somewhere else or died out. And coming back to this this plot where we see all the sort of extinction dates of the different sites, and we have this period of decline here, we can express that another way, which is a chart I recently did. What this shows is a collection of number of sites. So this is the last 70 sites that appear in the Maya record, and it just covers from 800 up here to 920 or so. And what you seem to see is a pretty straight line. It seems to just come straight down here. So that suggests a gradual fall off. There were lots of people here, and then they steadily declined over this period. Now, although that looks very persuasive, I think that it's actually very misleading. The reason it's misleading is that this counts all sites. So quite a number of the sites in here are very small, and they're sites which only erect monuments in this period. So they're not part of a big continuous system. There's something that's small that crops up at the end. Also, there was a resurgence in the 9th century of sites in the north, which is a whole separate subject, very, very interesting, especially how that intersects with the idea of drought. But it distorts things when we're talking about the southern lowlands, the densest areas. What happens if we take that data out is the chart actually changes. It changes also for one further very important reason, which is that terminal dates are significant only when you put them into context. So Tikar's last date is in 869, but it didn't erect any monuments all the way from 810 to 869. 810 is where things really come to an end. And many of these sites, or let's say a significant number, have this feature. And we can look at the detail of how this was working around 810 by looking at Aguateca. So this is the same site which we had all the warriors attacking, the burning, and the Pompeii place. The largest structure here is L88. This is a modern photograph of it. It was excavated by Takeshi Inamata, and what he showed was that this building was not complete. It was under construction. You could see that because there's a construction ramp at the bottom here, but you have exposed what we call construction bins. So these are walls, These are little walls which are used to stabilize. They would build a wall and then fill it with rubble, and it makes a much more stable structure. There's also a depression here, which looks as if they were building a tomb chamber, but never actually got around to doing it. The fascinating thing is that out in front, we have monuments. We have a stela here, which is 4.4 meters high, and it has been smoothed, ready for carving, but it was never carved. And we have something called Altar M. Now, Altar M, you can see it's difficult to see, but there's really no doubt that it records the date 9 Ahau. That gives you 919,000, which is the year 810. When it was found, it was thought to be simply eroded, and it is eroded. But in fact, when you look at it closely, it's not simply eroded. It was also never finished. What this tells us is that we can date the destruction of Aguateca very accurately. We can say that it was destroyed before 810. And in fact, they were building the monuments to celebrate that period ending when the site was destroyed. This is a pattern that we find in other places. The famous murals of Bonham Park, the great battle scenes and scenes of royal arrangement and dancing and all of these things, is very well known and is magnificent. It's also very late. And in fact, it was never finished. Here you can see that the main text has been painted out, but these captions, the names of all these characters, had not been filled in. The last date, which is actually buried somewhere down here, is 791. So the idea that they were painting this somewhere around 800 is not unrealistic. This is another unfinished thing. And like the building at Aguateca, we find many structures across the Maya area which were under construction. They have piles of stone neatly stacked up, ready to be laid. And of course, we don't know exactly when things were abandoned, but it seems increasingly likely that it was all at a very similar time. So if we look at the flourishing of Maya civilization, up to 810, we have these sites all very active. But after 810, there's much. And some of these, like Copan, well, the last date there is 822, or Comalcalco, 814. So it's really, we're getting thinner still. If we take out the ones where there were hiatus episodes, in other words, where there were big gaps, then it gets even fewer. And so I don't think we are talking about a slow 100-year decline. I think what we're looking at is a very rapid event, which I call the early 9th century crisis. And that led to the abandonment of not all sites, but many sites. So that idea of the decline, I think we can replace with the idea of a kind of coda, that there was an event somewhere shortly before and shortly after 810, and then it played out over the next 100 years. It was 100 years before everything finally ended. So let's look at the sort of the newer evidence of what was going on at that time. We know that architectural styles were changing. We know that ceramic forms were changing. We know that motifs, iconography, including some deities, were changing. Elements of the writing system were changing, and fluorescent, powerful, important centers were changing. Now, this, you might recognize Bill, those of you who know the museum. This is us moving Caracol Altar 13 into position in the new gallery. And when you do a new gallery, you have to do, of course, new research and really try and rethink everything in the collection and write new captions and details about them. And I knew that Altar 13 from Caracol was important and significant. It's significant not least because the date is 820. So this is the 10-year event that follows the great early 9th century crisis. And it's a crisis that did not affect Caracol. They steam on quite happily. There's features of this text which are very interesting. We see two characters, one presenting some feathers and a captive to a lord over here who is clearly the king of Caracol. We have his name up here. In fact, his name appears over here as well. And this character is named not once or twice, but 3 times. This is his caption, and he appears twice more in this. Now, let's look at him. So his name is Papa Malil. And apart from the fact that that is an odd name, he has a title which is Chikin Kalomte. This is a very late spelling, but nonetheless, it's part of that whole system. Now, Kalomte is something that we've sort of paid some attention to it, but I think we've still underestimated how significant Kalomte is. Kalomte is the highest title of Maya kings. So not all kings are Kalomtes. Only a few at any one. And the Kalomte title is directionally organized. So there's a version for the north, there's a version for the east, the south, and the west. And in fact, that version is the Western version. It's Chikin Kalomte. And that's actually the most common. It seems to have all sorts of resonances to do with the West and sort of powerful forces out there linked originally to the great site of Teotihuacan. The others are rarer, but nonetheless quite significant. This information tells us that that figure, so the sort of seeming subordinate figure, actually outranks the king. And he outranks the king, he's mentioned more often than the king. And it was thanks to some other work that I was doing for my book that I began to realize that let's just skip back here. That these scenes are not necessarily fully reflecting the relationship between the characters depicted. What I mean by that is that we seem to see the subordinate presenting to the Lord. We have other scenes where the text tells us something very different. It tells us actually that the relationship is inversed. What I suspect is going on is that this is a piece of rhetoric. This is a royal rhetoric which is on display in the site of Caracol. And they are presenting things in a way which makes their guy look good. The text, on the other hand, I think is more faithful. And around here, it's telling us that Papa Malil, the Western Kalomte, is overseeing events conducted by the Caracol king. In fact, that whole relationship is repeated around here as well. This is reserved for hierarchical relationships where someone is supervising, where someone is overseeing in a hierarchical sense. So there are lots of reasons to think that Papa Malil is not the subordinate. Papa Malil is actually the person in charge. And we know that he is based at a site called Uconal. Uconal was a perfectly normal Maya kingdom, but with Papa Malil there, it becomes much, much more important. There we go. So we can see the two of them. Now, one final thing about Patmalia, which is interesting. He's wearing very little clothing, as you can see. They're both, it's probably high summer. But this headdress is quite significant. And there's a late figurine in a site museum where you can see the same head wrap. It's a beaded head wrap. It's not really a hat. It's something which is tied on the back. In fact, you can see the knot here where it's tied along the back. And the feathers, 3 feathers coming out the top. This piece is typically used to identify people from the West, non-Maya, or let's say non-classic Maya people. And this, I think, fits in with what's going on. Now, something which I found, some colleagues of mine who I was troubling with questions pointed me towards it, and it, to me, was a little minor revelation. It's published in 1983 by a scholar called Lawrence Feldman, and it looks at names which were in this area when the Spanish arrived. And he actually, you can see here, features to look for in 8th century personal name lists. Kind of remarkable. This is exactly what we're going to do. The salient bit right now is that the prefixes for surnames used in the Chontal language. So this is a Western Maya people who had come from the West at some point in antiquity. Their names often begin with Pa. And of course, one can see immediately how that ties into Patmalil. That name, as strange as it is not strange if it was a Chontal Mayan. Now let's widen a little bit more and go on to some other sites here. So we can see Sebal, and here's Ukanal. Caracol is down here, but also the site of Nakum, which very rarely features in any discussions, and that's because the work there is very new. At Ukanal, instead of things getting worse, things get better. The population grows. Their temples are rebuilt, and new kinds of ceramics come in. So we have those molded ceramics and a type called fine paste, which was made originally on the Gulf Coast of Mexico. You can see here these circular structures. Now these are built on the top of older pyramids. So the pyramids are quite old, but the temples on top are new. Now this is Nakum. Nakum, excavated by my good friends from Poland, and have been working there for about 10 years or more. And what they've shown is that this whole area here was rebuilt in the 9th century. So a time when Tikal is beginning to look like it did at the beginning of this talk, this is being rebuilt and in this kind of style. So Nakum is fluorescent, Nakum is wealthy, Nakum is succeeding, and excavations in the surroundings show that their population was getting considerably bigger. And it's very likely that Nakum is attracting people who are abandoning other sites, because many Maya sites are already completely deserted, or nearly so. So this is a dynamic where there are less people, but they are gathering in these new power centers. Now, the really sharp-eyed people will have noticed here this circular structure. Circular structures are not at all Maya sites, but it is at Nakum. The biggest circular structure is at Sebal. At Sebal, it's at the end of its own causeway. So this is buildings excavated by Jerry back in the 1960s. Now that's very, very interesting. Now in the past, people have linked these circular structures to new movement. In particular, a new deity coming from the West, one which many people have heard of, Quetzalcoatl. This is the feathered serpent. We don't have feathered serpent imagery, but the feathered serpent was celebrated in his wind aspect, a deity called Ecological, with circular structures in central Mexico. So the idea is that this is part of a kind of religious diffusion that's coming from the West. And in fact, we see not only these circular structures up here in Yucatan in the north, we find a lot of them on these riverways, which are coming into the central area. So here is Ceibal, here is Nakum, and Ucanal. There are other circular structures down here at Ishtonton and Calzada Mopan and other sites. So circular structures are late, they come in quickly, and they're associated with new ceramics. Now, at Ceibal, let's look a little bit more at the very big changes that took place at this time. I know I've got very short of time here, so I apologize. I'm going to hurry up a little bit. The monuments that surrounded that structure were very interesting. And this is Stela 10. We'll come back to that in a second. Now, some of them are very, very conventional. You can see this is a typical Maya profile. But if you look at this set, and these are the 4 buildings surrounding Temple A3 at Ceibal, you can see different kinds of faces. These are typical classic faces. These are not typical classic faces. So the moustaches, this sort of flat forehead, this sort of snubby nose, as opposed to this sort of kind of big Maya-style nose. Now, that's interesting, but the really strange thing is that this is all the same person. And it's not just the same person, it's the same person on the same day. This is one celebration, and he's depicted 4 times in 4 different ways, and some of them look very Maya and some of them don't. And this was part of the evidence that these are actually people who come from the West, and that these are versions of the Maya. So in the words of a colleague of mine, this is code switching. This is him showing himself in different forms. And you could argue it either way. You could say, well, he's basically Maya, but here he is pretending to be somewhere else. Or you could say he comes from somewhere else and he's, in a sense, pretending to be Maya. Okay. So, Ceibal Stela 10. So this is the dates we're talking about, mid-9th century. And this text is really, really crucial. It tends to have been undervalued over the years. We've known what it said for a long time. The problem is not what it says. The problem is, what does it mean? Up here, we have the name of the king. This is Watul Katel. So this is this guy. He's the guy on all of those monuments. And he's the holy lord of Ceibal. And then we have a verb, and it's a secondary clause, and it tells us that it was seen. So this is the ceremony that he's conducting up here. It was seen by this king of Tikal, this guy who is the king of Calakmul, this guy who is the king of Motul de San Jose, and it happened at Ceibal. So in 849, the kings of Tikal, Calakmul, Motul de San Jose come to Ceibal. Now this is a massive inversion of the political order of the classic period. Ceibal is a podunk place. Tikal, Calakmul are the great superpowers. Something radical has changed that they would then decide, they were deemed to come to the minor center of Ceibal. A little thing about that name, because Watul Katel, this is like Pap Malil in the sense that it's not a real typical Maya king's name. In fact, it doesn't really make any sense. And it's previously been suggested, even back in the 1990s, that this might be the rendition of a foreign word. It's not clear in what language, it's not readily identifiable even in Chontal Maya, but it certainly is very strange. Now, quickly, a few other features. Ucanal, of course, this is where Pap Malil is based. This is slightly later than his time. But here you can see that they're using the square day names. So it's the king's name. He's a Kalomte, so he's a high king. This is his sort of normal name. He has a square day name there too. Another guy, this is at the site of Washaktun. But this is the king of Washaktun down here. This guy is someone else. He is witnessing the period ending, and his name is Olom. Olom, what a strange name. We don't have that somewhere. Olom does turn up on the mold-made ceramics. So this allows us to date those to even greater refinement. We know that around 830 to about 850, people were producing his name up there. This style of molded ceramics, and this particular form is typical of Belize. This is more like the eastern forms towards the Caribbean coast. This one is more typical of the central area, the kind of things that were from Sebal, and it actually comes from Washakhtun. It was discovered there. And the reason I'm showing it is because we're seeing these lords, fine, fair enough, and we have a legible Maya text. Yeah, it's all very predictable. But their names are square day names. And they don't have anything else. They're not identified any other way. And I think if we were looking at these with a completely unbiased eye, we would say, well, these guys are probably foreigners. Mold-made ceramics are a feature of the Gulf Coast. This is a Gulf Coast mold-made ceramic. And here you can see a square day name. So this is actually very, very typical of that area. This is one from the region of Sebal. Again, the square day names with these warrior characters. And then just returning to these features, the architectural styles, the ceramic forms, the iconography, the writing system, everything has changed after 810. We still get people with conventional Maya king's name. They are still around. They're still at some sites, although they tend to be the poorer sites. They tend to be places even at Tikal, which are now falling into ruin, but they have some sort of active elite group. But the successful centers have guys with strange names, Papmalil, Olom, Watul Katel, and some others which we can't even quite read. These are strange people, strange names. I mentioned before, up here, we looked at this business about Pa being a prefix in Chontal Maya. This is also very interesting. Calendrical names are often Nawa in origin, 45% of people. Now, what that means is that Nawa is the language of central Mexico. And the calendric names in Nawa would be square day names. So it looks as if Papmalil and the square day names both make sense because Maya people in contact with central Mexico were using Mexican day names. And here's a selection of them here. Very strange things. And I recently identified some which aren't on here, which help to establish that it's not just any system, it actually is Nawa. So to conclude, we don't know what brought an end to the Maya. We don't know whether these changes are reacting to something or whether they're part of the instigation of it. But I think we can say something which hasn't been said before. There's two kinds of people in the 9th century Maya lowlands. There's guys that I call the new elite. They are all of them are Kalomte. All of them have strange names. They use a lot of fine paste and mold-made ceramics, and they have round temples. The old elites, they have traditional names. They're very, very seldom and tend to be only in very early periods, Kalomtes. They don't have much fine paste. They don't have many mold-made ceramics, and they don't have round temples. So the confusion that we had in the 9th century, we're seeing new styles, old styles, strange things from central Mexico, conservative Maya things, can be shifted into sort of two groups. One which stay very traditional, another which are innovative. They combine new and old features, and one has suspicions that they are not Maya. This, of course, is the obligatory book plug. This is all discussed in greater detail in a chapter here. I should point out that it is eye-wateringly expensive. So I know there are some aficionados out there who will purchase it, but these academic books are staggering prices, but it will come out in paperback eventually. With that, I have finished my talk. I apologize for overrunning, and I'm open to any questions that people might have.